Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we are going to continue in John's Gospel, chapter 13, and we're going to continue from the point that Judas has left the group and has gone to the Pharisees, to the Sanhedrin, to make his deal. Now before we start, I've got to bring you up to in mind to what is going through the disciples' minds and what they're experiencing. And I think you'll understand why Jesus starts the way he starts. Before the week began, these disciples believed with all their heart that Jesus was going to go to Jerusalem and set up his kingdom. And they were going to have a very prominent part in it. In fact, there's even recorded some of the conversations they had, such as who would be the greatest in that kingdom. And then that was really heightened. That concept was even heightened even further when he raised Lazarus from the dead after Lazarus was dead for 4 days. What power! Certainly there was power enough there to overthrow the Romans. And then on Monday, when he marches into Jerusalem and the hundreds of thousands of people are cheering, Hosanna, save now, it was a political statement, a political hope of the nation. These disciples were pretty much, pretty sure that Christ was going to set up his kingdom, and then they would have a prominent part in it. And then he tells the people, he tells the Sanhedrin, and he tells them that the Romans were going to crucify him. The very ones that he was supposed to overthrow would overthrow him. And they began to lose heart. In other words, many people, not the disciples, but many other people, believed that the statements made in Daniel chapter 7 concerning the, quote, Son of Man, and his kingdom would be forever and ever, the dominion would be forever and ever, they realized he wasn't the Messiah that was spoken of in the Old Testament. And therefore, the disciples also started to lose heart. And then, in the midst of all this, one of their own betrays them. Now, can you imagine when Jesus says that one of them would betray him? And we look at it and we say, well, there was an introspect. In other words, they looked within themselves, and asked the question, is it I? Is it I? But you also have to remember there was an outer look. Who is it? And they're looking and starting to blame one another. In other words, they're starting to fall apart. And then Judas leaves, and Judas betrays Christ, and he's pointed out by Christ as a betrayer, and he leaves the group. And now they are disheartened. They are about ready to break up. They see the group breaking up. They see all their hopes and aspirations going down the drain. And Jesus is going to take this opportunity, which is now about Thursday night after the Last Supper. He's going to take this opportunity to teach them and give them great promises. So from chapter 14, 15, and 16, there are tremendous promises given to the disciples. Now I say the disciples, and you have to understand it's direct. And then when we come to chapter 17, he in his prayer, he incorporates all the Gentiles in these promises. So we're going to take the effects of chapter 17 and we're going to apply them to us, these promises to us, as we go through. But at the beginning, these promises were made to the disciples. We weren't included into these promises until chapter 17. So we're going to start now. Now, what has Judas done? Well, Judas has disrespected not only the disciples, but he's disrespected the cause. He's disrespected Jesus himself. And therefore, by disrespecting Jesus, who is God, he disrespected God the Father. That's what Judas did. And Jesus is going to take that very concept of if you dishonor me, then you dishonor God the Father. He's going to take that concept and he's going to turn it to a positive note. And this is his positive note. Verse 31 of chapter 13. Therefore, when he was gone out, Jesus said, Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself, and shall straightway glorify him. In other words, basically what he is saying is this: it is now time that God the Father is going to be glorified. And not only is he going to be glorified, he is going to glorify me. And by glorifying me, he's glorifying himself. And this is the statement. Now we can take that and we can try to understand that. And it's hard for us to understand it if we look at it from human eyes. When we look at the cross of Jesus Christ, we do not see glorification. We see horrendous abuse. But glorification occurs in both Judas's betrayal and the cross. Why? Because God spoke and God predicted that this would happen, and he foretold that these things would happen, and therefore when they come about, as terrible as they are, it upholds his word. Therefore he is faithful to his word. He is glorified. And he's going to glorify Jesus in the acts that are going to come within 24 hours. He's going to glorify Jesus by raising him again from the dead. And then ultimately to raise him and watch him ascend into heaven and seated at the right hand of the Father. And the glorification will continue, and we will be part of that glorification later on in the future. And now he says this. So we have to understand that's what it is. Now we can take the negative if you want a simple illustration of the negative. I have 3 children. If someone dishonors my children, they are dishonoring me. And if they dishonor me, they dishonor my parents who raised me. I think almost everyone understands that. If that's the negative side of things, take the positive side. If someone honors my child, for whatever reason, they give him honor, then it honors me because I raised that child. And if it honors me, then it honors my parents who raised me. That's the concept that is spoken about here in verse 31 and 32. Then he says this in verse 33, little children, yet a little while I am with you. The little while he's talking about is literally less than 24 hours. You shall seek me, and as I said unto the Jews, where I go you cannot come. So now I say to you. And he's going to deliver them a message. Now what he is saying is this: look, there is a road I have to take, and there is a place I have to go that you cannot come. And there isn't a man living on earth, or that has ever lived on earth, that could take that position or go to that place. And where was that place? That place was to be the sacrifice. The sacrifice for the Savior of mankind. Nobody else could do that. Nobody else could go there. That's the only sacrifice that God the Father would accept, would be the sacrifice of his Son. And no one else could take his place, so no one else could go there. And he mentions there, where I go you cannot come. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you a commandment. A new commandment I give unto you. Now, that you love one another as I have loved you. Now, if you look at that, he's telling them to love one another. Many people believe that is the 11th commandment. I look at that commandment and I see it as not the 11th commandment, but a summary of the 10 commandments. Loving one another in a proper way, etc., is literally loving God. And so we love God and we love one another, and therefore it's all-encompassing. In other words, if you look at the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal. If I love my neighbor, I will not take from him. Thou shalt not kill. If I love my neighbor, thou shalt not kill. In other words, you're fulfilling the 10 commandments. So what we consider the 11th commandment is really a summary of the moral and ethical laws that exist between human beings. But he goes a little bit further and he says, love one another as I have loved you. Now that "as" is making a comparison. In other words, for 3 years, you have seen me, you have seen how I interacted with you, and in a very short while, you will see the greatest love of all expressed. My love for you will be expressed. In other words, I will give myself for you, and I will do it freely. And therefore, you must take that aspect of Christ's one-directional love and apply it. And this is what he was telling the disciples. And then he went on a little bit further, and he says this. He says this, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. How do you know that people are disciples of Jesus Christ? How do you know that? And unfortunately, we can mouth the words, loving one another, but we use all kinds of things. I have this PowerPoint up that says this, they will know we are Christians by our t-shirts. I can remember preaching one night, and during the sermon, I was dealing with this very aspect. In one of my points to the sermon, I was dealing with this aspect, and I said, not knowing what I was saying was actually true to someone in my congregation. I said that you can tell that I am a Christian by my license plate. It was unfortunate, but there was an assistant pastor, a pastor who was a pastor at one of our large corporations in the area. And he was very angry because on his license plate he had Jesus written across it. And I didn't mean to accuse him personally, but that is not how people know that you're a Christian, by what you wear, or by what church you attend, or by the license plate on your car. And he was very angry with me, and he told me so. And I'm afraid too many people are like this. As long as they're wearing the right t-shirt, and as long as they're have the right banner and the right label, etc., they think they're Christians, and they aren't. So therefore, if you are to love one another, you must love one another in action. In other words, you cannot just say, I love you. You know, it's like the little boy in the back of the classroom who is totally in love with a girl in the front of the classroom, but he never tells her, he never expresses it in any way. How in the world would she know? How would anyone know that he has a crush on this girl? No one would. And that is true. Can you imagine being in a marital relationship where one spouse never tells the other spouse or even shows the other spouse that they love each other? So therefore, people are to look at us, and they're to look at the way we treat one another, and therefore by it they know that we are Christians. Now let us check. Be very careful with this. There are a lot of groups of charity that do charity work that aren't Christians. Yet they're altruistic. They're very other man's oriented. And this is not what Jesus is talking about. There is a special bond that exists between believers. I can give you an example of this. I was taking a master's degree course in economics. And we were supposed to, the course, there were 300 people in that course, and we were going to tour all of New England and take 2 weeks and tour all of New England, and stopping at all the businesses and so on. And we were all to meet and register in this huge gym. And I walked in that gym, and there were 300 people there. 300 people I did not know. And yet, at the end of the evening, as we were traveling, and on our stop, I sat down at a table with 4 other Christians. Now, how did that happen? That happened because of there's a common bond, and that just comes out, and therefore people will recognize that we are Christians by the way we interact with one another. And therefore, this is what Jesus is saying. And all men will know that you're Christians because of this, not by what you wear or by what you say. And then he goes on. It says, Simon Peter said unto him, Lord, where thou goest? In other words, where are you going? And Jesus answers him, where I go, you canst not follow me now. Now notice that it's now, but you are going to follow. But thou shalt follow me afterwards. And certainly Peter did. Jesus Christ, within 24 hours, was crucified and hanging on a cross. Peter was not. But it's not too long from now, a number of years from now, Peter is also going to hang on a cross, just like his master. In other words, he could not follow. He was not following now because this was a moment for Christ to pay the sacrifice for man's sin. But he would suffer like his master suffered later on, and he did. And Jesus is telling him that right now. And Peter said unto him, Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I will lay down my life for thy sake. In other words, I'm willing to die for you. And Jesus said, wilt thou lay down thy life for my sake? You really going to die for me? Really? Verily, verily, I say unto you, the cock shall not crow till thou hast denied me 3 times. Here is a man who was outspoken. Here was a man who confessed that Jesus was the Messiah. Here was a man who was impetuous, who literally, as we go into the garden scene, etc., in the Olive Garden when he is arrested, where he cuts the ear off, he attacks the soldiers. Here is a man who's willing to, quote, lay down his life, yet we know that he denies the Lord 3 times. And he does it over and over and over again in front of a very weak individual, a maid. And therefore he's saying, you're going to do this before the rooster crows. And we look at the time in Asia Minor, we look at the time of the sun setting, and when the sun starts to peek over, we're looking at somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 3:30, between 3:30 and 4:30, the cock will crow for the first time. And in other words, before that occurs, Peter will deny him 3 times. And Peter would probably sit there and say, no, that's not going to happen. I will never do that. But he did do it. And we know what happened after he did. He realized what Jesus had said, and he went out and he wept bitterly, because that was a picture of what he is like without Christ. He is weak, and we are all that way without Christ. Then we begin in chapter 14, the very famous first 6 verses, extremely famous. I don't know if we'll get through it all this morning, but we look at it, and here he says this, let not your hearts be troubled. In other words, they were a mess. They were a mess. Everything was falling apart, and they were about to break up, etc. And he says, they were despondent. And he says, let not your heart be troubled. In other words, don't worry. Relax. Don't worry. Do you believe in God? Believe also in me. Or you want to reverse it? Believe in me, you'll believe in God. Doesn't matter how you say it, how you put it. It all comes out the same. Now, let's stop for just a moment. You've got to understand what to believe means. Did they believe that Jesus was the Messiah? Yeah, many of them had confessed. A lot of the disciples did not believe he was the Messiah, and they didn't come to that view until after the resurrection. Even his half-brother James did not believe he was the Messiah till after he was resurrected. But you have to understand what believing is. So I'd like to take you to 1 John and read a verse that you might find quite interesting. 1 John chapter 5 is a verse that many people quote for the assurance of salvation. Verse 13, it says, John is writing and he's saying, these things have I written unto you that believe. He's writing to believers. On the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. That is what everybody says. See, we have the right to know that we are saved. And look at the next phrase. and that you may believe on the name of the Son of God. Wait a minute. He's writing to believers that they may believe. Now Jesus comes here and he's speaking to a number of disciples that are believers. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God? Believe also in me. In other words, what is it that believing means? And ask yourself this: is it possible to stop believing? Here I am a believer. Is it possible for me to stop believing? And the answer is yes, it is. Believing here is trust. You trust in God, trust in me. That's what Jesus is saying. In other words, basically what he was saying is trust in me. Trust me when I'm telling you this. God, trust me when I tell you that even though I told you that I will be crucified, trust the fact that God is going to be glorified through it. Trust it. And therefore, it's possible, and many believers have, they believe Jesus for salvation, they praise the Lord for X number of time, etc., but as time passes, they wane and they wander, and they stop believing, they stop trusting Jesus, and they begin to worry that they're even saved. Then he says this: in my Father's house are many mansions. Now, let's make it this way. It's one house. It's not a whole lot of different houses. It's one house with a lot of mansions. And I should say this: it's one house with a lot of rooms. Would probably be a better rendition. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And therefore, he's saying this: if I go, and he is. To this day, Jesus has left this earth almost 2,000 years ago, and he has prepared a place for us. There is a place for me. There is a place for my wife. There is a place for my children. There is a place for people I have led to the Lord. There is a place for them. God has made a place for them. He says this: if I go, if that is true, and it should read, since I go and prepare a place for you, don't you think I'll come again? Doesn't it make sense that God has got all this room up in heaven, this huge building up in heaven, and I'm not sure it's a building, it's more like a place where he resides. And there's a place for all of us who believe. That's what he says, and therefore, doesn't he have to come back and get us? And that is what he's saying there. He says, I will come unto you, and I will receive you unto myself. Now, you have to look at the word receive. The second definition of the word receive is to invite one into one's house. You saw this back in John chapter 1, when you 1:12, where it says, for as many as receive him, to them become the children of God. And there, for as many as invite him into their house, they become the children of God. Now he's saying this: I have gone to build a place for you, and I will come back and I will invite you into my house. In other words, the invitation is reversed. In other words, you had invited me into your house, now I'm going to invite you into my house. And you must understand that where I am, there you may be also. And therefore, we're going to end at that spot, but you have to understand that wherever Jesus is, that's where we will be. Now, when people look at that, they look at it and they say, oh, Jesus is in heaven, therefore we will be in heaven. Well, what happens when Jesus comes to earth to rule? Will we be with him? And the answer is yes, we will be with him. And, well, what happens in the new heaven and the new earth when Jesus is in the new Jerusalem? Will we be there? And the answer is yes, you will be there. In other words, where Jesus is, that's where we're going to be. And we, like Daniel was told at the end of the book, at the end of chapter 12, it will be later on in the future when Jesus, God Almighty, assigns our lot for our faithfulness to him. And that means wherever he is, we will be there because our lot will have been assigned to us. Looking at this passage, we will say this: we have a room or a place in heaven that Jesus is building for us. And therefore he will come back and invite us into his house. He will receive us into his house. This is what he's talking about. Why? Because we have received him into ours. And that is a promise that is made to them. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pick it up here next time. There is another passage that is another verse that is very, very important, verse 6. But we need to understand what that is. Very clearly you have to understand. And so we'll leave that to next time. So until next time, I bid you Godspeed from On Victory's Side. We'll see you.